There is a version of history that begins with kings, with armies, with monuments carved in stone and laws pressed into clay. That version is taught in schools. It fills museums. It dominates the popular imagination of what human civilization means. It skips 97% of our story. Before the kings, before the armies, before the first wall was ever raised or the first seed deliberately planted, there was a different world, a world that lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, a world in which human beings were healthy, free, and deeply intelligent, a world that we abandoned, and a world that once abandoned could never be recovered. This is the story of how that happened and why it matters more than almost anything else you will ever learn about our species. For the vast majority of human existence, we moved. We followed the rains. We tracked the migrations of animals across open landscapes. We read the land the way you read a language, fluently, instinctively, because our survival depended on it. We built nothing permanent. We claimed nothing as exclusively ours, and we left nothing behind heavier than the ashes of a fire or the mark of a footprint in soft ground. The people who lived this way were not primitive. That word implies they were waiting for something better. They were not waiting. They had arrived. Skeletal remains from the late Paleolithic tell a story that will surprise you. These were tall people, well-nourished people, men and women whose bone density and physical condition would not be matched by European populations again until the 20th century. Their teeth were largely healthy. Their bones showed none of the repetitive stress injuries that would later plague the first farmers. They suffered no mass famines. They experienced no epidemics. They were not stumbling through darkness. They were thriving in a world they understood with extraordinary precision. A hunter who could track a wounded animal across broken terrain for 3 days, reading signs in disturbed soil and bent grass, was not unsophisticated. A woman who knew which plants reduced fever, which bark dulled pain, and which roots would kill you in winter was carrying a library in her memory that had been built across thousands of generations. This knowledge did not need to be written down. It lived in story, in practice, in the act of one person showing another how to survive. And the social world that sustained them was built on a principle that seems almost strange from where we stand today. The inability to accumulate created equality. Food could not be stored for long, meat spoiled, wild grain could not easily be kept in quantity. And because surplus was impossible, hoarding was impossible. And because hoarding was impossible, monopolizing power was impossible. If any individual became too controlling, too aggressive, too demanding, the response was simple. Everyone else left. In a world without fences or fixed property, freedom was not a political idea, it was a physical act. You exercised it by walking away. This balance held for tens of thousands of years. Human populations remained low and stable. The climate reinforced the arrangement. The planet was colder, more volatile. Ice advanced and retreated across the northern latitudes. Temperatures swung sharply over centuries. No landscape remained stable long enough to reward prominent investment. Agriculture was not merely undiscovered. In the world of the Pleistocene, it was climatically impossible. Then, the ice began to melt. Approximately 12,000 years ago, the planet entered a new era, the Holocene, warmer, more stable. And in one particular corner of the world, this shift created conditions that would redirect the entire course of human history.
The region we now call the Fertile Crescent, a broad arc stretching from the eastern Mediterranean coast through what is now southern Turkey and down through the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, became extraordinarily productive. Wild grains grew here in dense, naturally occurring stands: emmer wheat, einkorn, barley, lentils, chickpeas, not planted, not cultivated, just growing season after season in quantities that no foraging band had ever encountered before. Gazelle herds moved through these valleys in numbers that made hunting almost effortless. For the bands living here, the fundamental equation of survival shifted. For the first time, the energy gained from food substantially exceeded the energy spent finding it. Surplus had arrived, and surplus changes everything. The people who first took advantage of this abundance were a culture we now call the Natufians, and what they did next contains the first great surprise in the story of civilization. For generations, historians assumed that agriculture caused settlement. People learned to farm, built villages to tend their crops, and civilization followed. It seemed logical. It was also completely backwards.
The Natufians settled without farming. The wild abundance of the Fertile Crescent was so reliable, so consistently generous, that it removed the need for movement entirely. For the first time, a foraging people found that staying in one place was not just possible, it was better. They built permanent houses, circular structures with stone foundations. They carved heavy storage pits into the earth. They constructed grinding stones weighing hundreds of pounds, objects that no mobile band would ever carry across a landscape. Everything they built was designed for people who intended to stay. And with permanence came something that had never existed before in human experience. When you move across a landscape, it is a passage. It belongs to no one, because no one stays long enough to claim it. But when you build a house in a place and bury your grandmother beneath its floor, the land transforms. It becomes memory. It becomes lineage. It becomes something you owe a debt to. The Natufians began burying their dead in formal cemeteries attached to their settlements. The concept of ancestry, of belonging to a place through the generations of your family resting within its soil, crystallized in the human mind for the first time. This was not merely a cultural shift, it was a cognitive one, and its consequences have not yet finished unfolding. Settled life also had a direct biological effect. In a mobile band, a mother can carry only one infant at a time. The physical demands of constant movement, combined with extended nursing, naturally space births by 4 or 5 years. Settle into a permanent village, and that constraint disappears overnight. Natufian women began having children every 2 years. Communities that had numbered a few dozen people expanded into villages of several hundred. And those hundreds of people were consuming the wild resources around them faster than those resources could recover. The abundance that had made settlement possible was being eaten alive by the population that settlement had created. Then, around 10,800 years before the Common Era, the climate struck back. A catastrophic cooling event swept the northern hemisphere with terrifying speed. Enormous quantities of glacial meltwater poured into the North Atlantic, disrupting the ocean circulation patterns that regulated global temperatures. The Levant cooled rapidly, woodlands shrank, grasslands thinned. The dense wild grain stands that the Natufians had built their entire world around began to retreat. The ecological foundation beneath them was collapsing. They faced a choice with no good answers. One option was to abandon the villages, break up the communities, and return to a fully mobile life. But the population that sedentism had created was far too large for the wild landscape to support as foragers. Going back
meant reducing the population drastically. The other option was to intervene, to stop waiting for the wild to provide and to begin actively managing what grew, to clear competing plants, to select productive seeds and replant them deliberately, to control water, to farm. This is where agriculture actually begins, not in ambition, not in the gradual discovery of a better way of life. Agriculture was born from desperation, from communities too large to retreat and facing resources too scarce to simply harvest. The first farmers did not choose farming over foraging because farming was better. They chose it because they had no other path forward. Farming was not a discovery, it was a rescue operation, and the cost was immediate and severe. The diverse diet of the forager, built from dozens of plant species, varied proteins, fibers, and micronutrients gathered across a wide seasonal range, collapsed into a narrow dependence on a handful of starchy crops. The bones record this shift without ambiguity. Average adult height in early farming populations of the Near East fell by several inches compared to their forager ancestors. Dental cavities, which are caused largely by the sugars in processed grains, became endemic almost overnight. Iron deficiency appeared. The physical markers of malnutrition entered the archaeological record for the first time in human history. The labor intensified. Processing grain required hours of crouching and repetitive motion at grinding stones. Skeletal remains from early agricultural villages show patterns of joint damage and spinal compression that simply do not exist in forager populations. Women, who performed much of this processing work, often exhibit chronic injuries in their knees, feet, and lower backs that speak to years of labor performed in a single position. Farming did not liberate people from hard work. It invented a new and more exhausting kind of it. And then came the diseases.
Hunter-gatherer bands, small and mobile, were moving targets for pathogens. A contagion that burned through one group would exhaust itself before it could spread far. In a dense, stationary village, that dynamic reversed completely. People living in close quarters, sharing water sources contaminated by waste, sleeping alongside newly domesticated animals whose bodies hosted their own microbial communities, created ideal conditions for infectious disease to persist, to spread, and to evolve. Influenza, tuberculosis, measles, smallpox, the diseases that would define human suffering for the next 10,000 years, found their first permanent home in the farming village. And yet, the agricultural engine expanded. It expanded because farming produced more calories per unit of land than foraging ever could. Individual health declined. Collective population grew. The logic was merciless. More people lived shorter, harder, sicker lives. And more people meant more farmers. And more farmers meant more land under cultivation. And more land under cultivation meant fewer places left for foragers to go. The world of the open landscape was being consumed from the inside. With density came a problem humanity had never faced at this scale. How do you live permanently beside strangers? In a foraging band, everyone knows everyone. Trust is personal. Conflict is resolved simply by separation. If two families cannot coexist, they divide. The landscape absorbs them. But in a farming village, that option is gone. A farmer has invested months of labor into a single plot of soil. His survival is bound to that ground. Leaving means abandoning the harvest. Abandoning the harvest means starvation. The land, which farming had turned into property, now held its cultivators in place as surely as a chain. And fixed property created targets. A granary full of stored grain was not only security, it was an invitation. Raiding became rational. If your group needed food and another group had food stored behind a wall, the calculation of survival pointed in one direction, and so the walls went up. At Jericho, around 8,000 years before the Common Era, a massive stone perimeter wall was raised around the settlement, along with a tower nearly 9 meters tall. Whatever its precise purpose, the message encoded in that architecture was unmistakable. This belongs to us, and we will defend it. Coordination on this scale required leadership. Someone had to plan the wall. Someone had to direct the labor. Someone had to decide how stored resources were distributed. Gradually, certain individuals accumulated influence, and in a sedentary society where you cannot simply walk away from the person who holds power over your food supply, influence begins to look less like social standing and more like control. The burials of this period begin to tell a new story. Most remain simple, but a growing minority become elaborate, adorned with obsidian from distant mountains, shells from distant coasts, stones of vivid color carried hundreds of miles to mark the grave of a single individual. Status had entered the ground. Inequality was no longer temporary, it was becoming structural, permanent, inherited. Around 5,000 years before the Common Era, the populations of the Fertile Crescent pressed outward. The hill country was becoming crowded. Communities moved down from the highlands into a vast flat basin between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the land that would come to be called Mesopotamia. In its natural state, this landscape was hostile. Rainfall was scarce, summers were brutal, the rivers were volatile, capable of catastrophic floods that could erase years of work with almost no warning. The environment swung between drought and inundation with little mercy. But beneath those hazards lay something extraordinary. Over thousands of years, the rivers had deposited layer after layer of extraordinarily fertile silt across the entire plain. The soil of Mesopotamia was among the most productive on the surface of the planet. The challenge was water. There was either too much of it or none at all. The solution was to control it.
The settlers who moved into the southern alluvial plain built canals. They carved channels that carried river water across miles of flat terrain to fields that rain would never reach. They constructed embankments to contain the spring floods and direct their energy toward cultivation. They developed systems for allocating water among competing fields. And all of this required coordination on a scale no single household, no single village could provide. It required agreement among many people about shared resources and shared obligations. It required, in a word, governments. The authority that emerged from this necessity wrapped itself in religious language. The forces controlling the rivers were divine. The floods were the voice of gods. And those who claimed to interpret that voice, who could translate divine will into practical instructions about canal maintenance and water schedules, occupied a position of enormous practical power. This was the beginning of the temple economy, not a spiritual institution that also happened to manage resources, a resource management institution that used spiritual authority to make its control feel inevitable. By around 4,000 years before the Common Era, the landscape of southern Mesopotamia had been fundamentally transformed. It was no longer shaped primarily by climate and geology. It was an engineered system. And at the center of that system, where population density and productive capacity were greatest, something new was emerging: the city. Uruk crossed a threshold that no settlement had crossed before. At its height, between 40,000 and 50,000 people lived within its walls.
For a species that had evolved to live in bands of 30 or 40 individuals, a community of 50,000 was not an incremental development. It was an entirely new kind of world, and it required an entirely new kind of machinery to hold together. In a village, order is maintained by familiarity. You know everyone you deal with. Trust is personal. In a city of tens of thousands, that system cannot function. Each day, an ordinary person moved among crowds of strangers, people with no shared history, no personal obligation, no inherited relationship of accountability. Social cohesion could no longer rest on familiarity. It required institutions, formal rules that applied to everyone, regardless of who they knew. The temple complex at Uruk was the center of this institutional world. It controlled the surrounding fields, the canal networks, the herds of animals. It collected surplus, employed specialists, and redistributed resources across the urban population. The people of the city were bound to this institution in a relationship that was not quite slavery, but was nowhere near free. Access to food, to land, to protection, all flowed through institutional channels, and institutional access required compliance. Disobedience meant exclusion, and exclusion, inside city walls where you had no fields of your own, meant starvation.
The most common artifact found in the ruins of Uruk period sites across all of Mesopotamia is a simple clay bowl. Archaeologists call it the beveled rim bowl. Millions of them have been recovered. They're crude, mass-produced, nearly identical in size, made quickly without any concern for beauty or durability. Many were never even properly fired. They were not designed to last. They were designed to be used once and discarded. The uniformity of these bowls is their most important feature. Each one held a fixed volume, representing a standardized daily ration distributed to workers. These were not vessels for family meals. They were the physical embodiment of a wage system, proof that large segments of the urban population had been separated entirely from the means of producing their own food and were now dependent on measured allocations distributed by centralized institutions. Food had become compensation. Work had become abstract. The independent producer was gone. The dependent worker had arrived. As Uruk expanded, the volume of transactions exceeded the capacity of human memory to manage. Something new was required. What emerged was writing. But the earliest writing from Mesopotamia bears almost no resemblance to what most people imagine. There are no stories, no prayers, no history. The earliest clay tablets are accounting records, inventories, tax assessments, lists of workers and their daily rations. The first written symbols represent commodities and labor, barley, sheep, units of work. Writing did not begin as literature, it began as a spreadsheet, and it concentrated power in new ways. Those who could read and write became indispensable intermediaries between the population and the institutions that governed them. Obligations were now fixed in clay. They could be produced as evidence, enforced. The city had developed a form of memory that outlasted any individual administrator, institutional memory, and with it a new and unprecedented form of control. By around 2,500 years before the Common Era, the temple was losing its grip. A new power had risen to challenge it, the king. As Mesopotamian cities expanded and their territories collided, the disputes over land and water that had always simmered hardened into organized violence. Raiding gave way to armies. Armies required commanders. Commanders who won became rulers. And rulers offered the urban population a transaction that was brutally simple: protection from external violence in exchange for loyalty, labor, and taxes. Security became political leverage. The monopoly on force became the foundation of the state. War at this scale also transformed what happened to the defeated. In the world of mobile bands, a captured enemy was a problem. You could not imprison someone in a world without permanent structures. In a city with walls and canal systems requiring constant labor, captivity became economically rational. The defeated were put to work. Sumerian records from this period include a word for slave composed of two symbols, foreigner and human. Conquest was encoded directly into language. The great walls and canals of early civilization were built not only by citizens, they were built by people who had been taken in war and had no choice. Mesopotamia was not alone in this transformation. Along the Nile, protected by deserts on both flanks and fed by the extraordinary predictability of the annual flood, Egypt developed a different expression of the same underlying logic. Here, power and divinity merged completely. The pharaoh was not merely a king, the pharaoh was a god, the living guarantor of cosmic order, the sole force standing between creation and chaos. Power in Egypt did not need to justify itself through military competence or administrative efficiency. It justified itself through cosmic necessity. Far to the east, in the Indus Valley, a third independent center of urban civilization produced something that confounds every model we have built to explain how civilizations work. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro were planned with remarkable precision. Organized street grids, standardized bricks, underground drainage systems of a sophistication that would not be matched in most of the world for thousands of years. All of this implies powerful centralized authority, and yet there are no royal palaces, no monumental tombs for individual rulers, no triumphant images of kings in battle, no evidence of standing armies. If power existed here, it left almost no trace that matches what we see everywhere else. Their writing has never been deciphered. Their system of governance remains a mystery. Perhaps, as some have suggested, it was something the ancient world produced only once, a complex civilization without kings.
Across the Yellow River, across the Americas, in the highlands of the Andes, the same sequence played out again and again on different crops in different languages, among people who had no knowledge of each other. Surplus enabled population growth. Population density required coordination. Coordination produced hierarchy. Hierarchy gave rise to the state. The path from wild grass to city was walked independently on multiple continents because its logic is not cultural, it is structural. It follows from the basic properties of sedentarism, surplus, and density. The specific crops changed, the specific cultures changed, the underlying pattern did not. The world we inhabit today is not separate from this history, it is its continuation. The concentrated power of the state, the tension between institutional authority and individual freedom, the vulnerability of dense populations to epidemic disease, the replacement of local self-sufficiency with dependence on distant systems. These are not new problems, they are the original problems of civilization, still unresolved, still shaping the conditions of every human life on Earth. The forager who planted the first seed did not do so because she had glimpsed a better future. She did it because the world she knew was failing around her. What she built in response was extraordinary in its complexity and terrible in some of its costs. It produced abundance and hierarchy in the same motion. It created art and writing and science, and created slavery and epidemic disease in the same breath. Civilization was a trade-off, not a triumph. And the consequences were still compounding. By around 2,300 years before the Common Era, the age of isolated city-states was ending. Cities had grown, their territories had expanded. The competition for land and water had intensified beyond anything the old system could contain. Power was beginning to think at a larger scale. A question was forming at the edge of the political horizon that had never been asked before. If one authority could hold a city, could it hold 2? Could it hold 10? Could it hold everything between the rivers? In a city called Akkad, a man was rising who had already decided the answer was yes. He had not inherited a throne. He had not been born into the priesthood. He had built everything he had from nothing, through military genius, political cunning, and an appetite for dominion that the kings of individual city-states had never possessed. He would not govern a city. He would bind the cities of an entire civilization into a single political body, held together by force, by administration, by the sheer ambition of a man who had decided that the limits of kingship were a question to be answered, not a boundary to be respected. His name was Sargon, and what he built was the first empire the world had ever known.